Mohsen Mahdavi, or as many on the pro-Palestinian side like to say, Mohsen Mahdavi, that's a really bad joke, uh, has been sort of released from detention, as opposed to what you see on the media, because even I wasn't sure when I was first looking into it. He was basically just released from detention, which we'll talk about that part, but his sort of like detention or his basically deportation process is still ongoing. And today we'll discuss some parts of what we know from the court filings, as well as I think we can do a bit of a reminder of who this guy is. We've covered him in the past. Some of it is not necessarily, sort of warranting a deportation, while some of it I think possibly can be. And then maybe even talk a bit broadly about sort of both. We have one more case from Harvard University that I think we can talk about a bit later if we have time, but also specifically Colombia keeping people like Mahdavi, keeping people like Mahmoud Khalil, sort of allowing them to stay at the university while knowing all of this is going on, while like the facts of this case or many facts of this personality is not something new, not something we didn't know in the past. Well, new stuff has been released, and sort of my worry is, whether they do get deported or not, is what are our universities doing, sort of allowing people like this to basically graduate from prestigious universities and get sort of the credibility of them. Joining me today are Jonathan Honig and Adam Mosov. Welcome to the reality show. It's great to have you both here. And yeah, I mean, to go to you, Adam, I think we had you on a few weeks ago where I think we talked about Mahmoud Khalil specifically. But yeah, have you been following this case? I think these cases are very similar. They basically are friends. My understanding is they work for the same um, or they are heads of the same organization, the Students for Justice in Palestine, I think it's the name of it. So yeah,
Yeah,
Adam, what do you make of that?
it's Students for Justice in Palestine, which is a national organization. And as I've mentioned before, there are, I mean, um, the U.S. Department of Justice even last year said that Ayn Rand was funding organizations and groups in the United States to promulgate, unrest and various other activities of this sort. And so, I mean, there's credible allegations that SJP is, being funded by a terrorist organization, a terrorist government, and his connections to terrorist organizations. So I mean, so this is very serious because so there's multiple levels that we have to disentangle, right? So there's like the universities and the university policies, right? Especially like university like Columbia, Harvard, they're private universities. They can set their own policies. And then the question is, are they applying their policies legitimately? So are they, violating the rights of Jewish students by not applying policies that they have applied against other people? And there are some good lawsuits that have been filed against Columbia, including by the janitor who was falsely imprisoned by the SJB protesters last year, and by some students as well who are saying that their contract rights and property rights were violated by the Columbia permitting these protesters to interfere with their ability to obtain an education at a school where they're paying $90,000 a year to get an education. And so there's that issue. Then there's the issue of whether, to the extent the university is actually endorsing and promoting these protesters, as we've been seeing at Harvard and other places. And then there's the question that these protesters themselves, the activists, so to what extent are they committing crimes? To what extent did they commit perjury or fraud on their green card applications and coming to the United States? Both of those crimes and the fraud or perjury are bases for revocation of the green card and a deportation. And then a question becomes to extent do they receive due process as a result of that? I mean, and these are all very important issues and questions, and they're often kind of intermingled and intertwined in a lot of people's minds. And there's a lot of confusion too. People think this is about free speech and things of this sort as well. So I mean, I just kind of wanted to lay out that groundwork or framing for people so that we can have kind of I think a productive and profitable conversation about this.
Yeah, yeah, and Daniel, Adam points out all the different elements, into conversations such as these, and makes me think of a comment that Leonard Peikoff made years ago, and I'm probably butchering it, but it was something to the effect of what the three biggest challenges facing college students are: depression, drug abuse, and going to class. Simply making the point that so many of these unsavory, anti-Semitic, anti-Western, anti-modernity ideas have festered on universities for decades now. And Adam is a professor, and he's seen it probably much closer than I have. But this is a place where they've allowed people like this gentleman, other completely unsavory people, spout, grow, become on staff, become affiliated, speak, and influence young minds.
Yeah.
So as a first thing I think we can cover is the free speech issue, or basically how people have been trying to make this about free speech,
Yeah.
which fundamentally it is not. And this is not even starting when Trump got into office and some deportations started happening or some proceedings started happening. Even before, when you had the what we call campus intifada, where you had these protests going all over the place, and in some places they started getting shut down because they were occupying buildings, they were harassing Jewish students. They said this is like a free speech issue. It never was. All universities or all students at those universities that have done it properly were able to do it. There was no problem. And the only time where something started shutting down was again when they started occupying buildings, when they started sort of like disturbing peace. And that is just the difference. And similar thing is happening here. Like you could say sort of, especially with Mahmoud Khalil and Mohsen Mahdawi, that they are sort of like known figures. But what they are doing again is something or something that at least there are grounds for some suspicion for a possible deportation. And again, trying to make it about free speech is again a wrong way to think about it. I mean, I found it hilarious when I think it was Mahmoud Khalil who was, I think, arrested, and there was a big protest by the I think it's the Jewish Voice for Peace, and they did it by violating property rights of one of Trump's hotels. So again, like I I sometimes, especially with some of the other deportations that have been happening by Trump administration, I am careful. I want to be careful that nothing crazy is happening. But when the other side is like violating rights at every point, and every action they are taking is inherently that is violence. Like going into somebody's building and staying there, not wanting to remove, is violence. You are violating the property rights, and making this about free speech, making this about First Amendment is simply not the case. I mean, Adam, what do you make of the whole thing of free speech? I mean, in
Well,
some ways,
I
it's
saw
nice
Jonathan
that
was about
America
to.
has such a first, like
Well,
First
no, I mean,
Amendment.
yeah, I mean, I was
Oh,
just going to jump in. It reminded me, and Adam, you might remember, maybe one of our audience members could remind us of Ayn Rand's perspective on public protest. That your right to free speech doesn't mean you can go clog the public streets, or I would interpret that of other areas. And yesterday happened to be May Day, and I was in a cab coming back from a family member's, and I had to get out of the cab and like walk, I don't know, a couple of miles to my apartment because the streets were clogged with people who were expressing their supposedly freedom of speech.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and she actually specifically spoke to these types of issues in her commentary on what was explicitly called the free speech movement at UC Berkeley in the 1960s, which was the very beginning of the kind of the student protests of the 1960s. And she explicitly said that what they are doing in those protests, where they were storming campus buildings, where they were occupying campus facilities, they were preventing classes from being held, they were just actively disrupting physically events and speakers. That's not free speech. That's action. I mean, I mean, yes, I mean, and there's always, as we call in the law, borderline cases. At what point are, does speech become incitement, become connection to some to other people's actions, and what type are, what point is someone being a conspirator and someone else's actions and things of this sort. But I mean, these are borderline cases. If you actually are criminally trespassing someone's property, right, which is what these protesters are, if you're actually occupying, if you're shutting them down, if you're committing vandalism, it's not just occupying. I mean, they committed millions of dollars in damage to the facilities at Columbia. They poured concrete down toilets. They just actively destroyed, rooms and buildings, covered them with graffiti. They did the same thing in Washington, D.C. And they were explicitly blocking Jews from accessing areas. I mean, I highly recommend people watch this video from that so-called peaceful encampment at Columbia last year, where there was a Jewish person who wanted to kind of walk among the encampment and see what was going on. And some person announces, there is a Zionist here. Everyone repeat after me. And it's very creepy. It's like, it's like this collectivist mob. They all kind of line up and they form a human wall and they start slowly moving forward to push the person off of the grounds of the campus quad area. I mean, that is not free speech. That's harassment. That's criminal trespass. That's false imprisonment, what they did to the janitor at Columbia. I mean, these are criminal actions. This is not free speech. And that is why that is why these people are being deported. They're not being deported because they got up at a scheduled event where they went through the university, it's a scheduling process, or they went to the police or whatever and reserved time to do a protest down a street. They didn't respect the time, manner, place regulations that control the use of public and even resources, or even, the rules governing private. That's speech. That is not why they are being held accountable. These people ran riot. Let's not forget, for 16 months. With zero consequences, either from the university enforcing its own rules and property rights, or zero actions by public authorities against explicit crimes.
Yeah, I think after the New York police actually went into Colombia and they made several arrests, I believe all the charges were dropped, or at least
every one of them.
So yes, and I think even now, I don't know if this was specifically Columbia or some other university, but at some point there was talk about, some people might not graduate. There was like a sort of like a scare for that, and even that was basically completely back down from that. And what, like, you could say that, these are crazy students, and this is something you expect from young people, sort of being a bit out there. But the fact that they are not getting any consequences, the fact that you have this sort of like elite university, right? These are like next public intellectual.
It's not even that they don't get consequences. Now they are lionized within that little community. They took on big bad Columbia. They took on the Jews. They took on the Zionists, and there's all that footage of them is going to be in their, montage for years to come. So there were no consequences for that. And I'd say the same thing about BLM as well. This just happens to be the subject of our discussion today.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and, and this goes to the, basic requirements of the rule of law, which is foundational to a society. And, and again, Ayn Rand commented on this repeatedly about the 1960s protests, that, that these were not exercises of free speech. These were criminal actions, these riots and other types of activities. And what was really bad about it was the breakdown in the rule of law, the sitting back of the authorities and allowing it to happen, and this is what then fosters just, for those of us who are old enough to remember the 1970s, which is rampant crime in this country, just unbelievable levels of crime, murders and vandalism and muggings in all the major cities, New York City in particular. And that is a natural byproduct of people watching police refusing to enforce the law, which is exactly what happened with the BLM riots as well. As Jonathan rightly said.
And we have somebody We have someone in the chat saying that we all know that if this were Black or Hispanic students, sort of being stopped from getting into classes or being stopped to basically move around freely on campus, that there would be a much bigger reaction. And yeah, I mean, something, Adam, you mentioned earlier is sort of the students yelling Zionists, basically, using that term instead of Jew. But the
Yeah.
way people use it is absolutely interchangeable. There is no, well, first of all, you cannot tell somebody's ideology by just looking at them, sort of like knowing if it's a Jewish person who believes in sort of well, and not to mention even sort of even using Zionists as a sort of like that's a justification to
Daniel, yeah,
do
you can
something
just,
to them
yeah,
is
it's not
alone.
it's not that they're interchangeable. It's that they learned a long time ago that saying we hate Jews is not acceptable. That's too obvious what they're talking about. So they found a better word to use that hides their racism, collectivism, and just evil views. So it's not that they're interchangeable. They mean Jew. I mean, that's what Zionist means in this context. It means Jew. It's just that, so, and the best evidence for this was, at UCLA when the pro-Hamas rioters took over the university library last year and were checking people's student IDs and not allowing Zionists to enter the university library. By the way, I mean, you talk about a criminal act. I mean, and this is right out of like 1930s. This is right out of brown shirt Nazis blockading universities in the 1930s. I mean, this is literally the exact same tactics, right? It's not like, oh, my last name is Goldberg. Oh, that means I'm a Zionist. That means you're keeping me out. No, they mean Jew. And that's the point is they slip very often. And you see them in this context, Daniel, using the terms interchangeably. And it's because it's not that they're it's just that this is their replacement term. By the way, we've seen this before. Racists do this who hate Black people, who hate Asians. They use code words, right? I mean, and the very people who embrace speech codes and have been crushing free speech and free academic inquiry for decades at university campuses around the country, including Harvard, right? Like if anyone got up at Harvard and said all Blacks, should go back to Africa, the way that they're saying it, Zionists should go back to Poland, right? That person would be expelled immediately. I mean, and by the way, this isn't hypothesis. I mean, this is exactly what they have been doing. They fired tenured professors for things that have been completely innocuous, including even using, the phrase niggardly, which is an English word that does not mean the pejorative term in reference to a Black person. Professors have been fired for using that term. And so, but all of a sudden, when it comes to Jews, oh no, now we take a stand. Now free speech, free inquiry. We can't shut down people. I mean, the double standard is so blatant and it's so obvious. And, and Harvard releasing that 355-page report just a couple of days ago really shows that. It confirms it across the board, just the blatant, double standard that, these universities are not to be promoted in their standing up for free speech and things of this sort. This is entirely serving the various evil ideologies that they have been teaching students and endorsing for years. Yeah, Jonathan.
Yeah, and sort of you made the.
Please,
Jonathan, do you want to?
Please.
Yeah. Sorry, my internet is a bit bad, so it's a bit delayed. So my reactions are not always the best. But yeah, you made a sort of a comparison to 30s Nazi Germany, and for those who think that you might be exaggerating or something, it's important to remember that sort of Hitler's rise to power, it didn't start with him, in Bavaria after he got out of World War I. He immediately started putting Jews into concentration camps. No, it took some time. It took some time for people to make it sort of acceptable. First, you galvanize, you point out a specific group, and you start blaming everything on that one specific, and you sort of you look other way when businesses or of those people are being destroyed. People look the other way. Then, as you said, when it comes to universities, they might stop getting in, and then slowly, if you are a Jew or if you're married to a Jew, lose some sort of privileges. Maybe sort of your marriage to a Jew will get sort of annulled by the state, and then at the end of that is the concentration camps, and that is something that has to be called out. That is something that when you see that starting happening, that's when it needs to be called out. You cannot wait for once concentration camp starts, that's probably too late to actually speak out. We are already on such a bad way, on such a sort of very bad war, but sort of on the railway to really bad place that you can no longer speak out. And yeah, to sort of I mean, unless you guys want to comment on it, we can return to Mohsen.
Yeah, well, I mean, just one quick, Adam, you probably deal with young people now, college age people in your work. And Daniel, you are a younger person and your contemporaries. But the sense I get among youth morality these days is that it's like big business, capitalism, Wall Street, the United States, same-sex marriage, and Israel they're all a part of the same fundamentally immoral foundation. That they put Israel right up there with Wall Street and their hatred of capitalism and their hatred of America. And it just seems so de rigueur on college campuses now that, it's not a question of how it's tolerated, but it just seems like it's accepted as what's moral. And those who defend Israel are, well, what's wrong with them? Everyone knows that Israel is the apartheid state. So it's just so frustrating and disgusting that all of those untruths have become fundamental on campuses across the country.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Adam,
so I mean, yeah, all of this, by the way, Israel's an apartheid state. It's a colonized, it's a colonial state. All of these claims and accusations, as a matter of intellectual history, go back to the early '60s and are actually rooted in Soviet propaganda. Because in the early '60s is when the United States finally became an ally of Israel. A lot of people there's a myth that the United States immediately supported Israel, and it's not true. It was only when Israel started to align more explicitly with the United States in the early 1960s. And by the way, that's also when Palestine is framed and is created. That's when the flag is created by Yasser Arafat, who was an Egyptian, by the way. And all of this goes to back to this, right? And it feeds into, and Jonathan, what you're identifying, right, is this kind of neo-Marxist and what's called intersectional ideology now, right? Which frames the world through this Marxist lens of there's always an oppressor and an oppressed. And you can see, and that's exactly how the Soviets were framing Israel when Soviets decided to back the Arabs, the Egyptians, and in Jordan and Saudi Arabia and others, starting in the '60s, and the U.S. started to back Israel during the Cold War, and so. This is why it's viewed as being acceptable, is that Israel, they view Israel now through this kind of Marxist lens of it's a colonial state, it's an apartheid state, it's, it's so on and so on. And by the way, all of this is just utterly false. And it takes like 20 minutes of knowing the history of a teeny bit of I just gave you to show you that it's false. But there's another deeper point, Jonathan, I think you made about how hatred of Jews is intimately linked with hatred of capitalism, hatred of freedom, hatred of the West, and things of this sort. And it is an interesting point to note that why is anti-Semitism, the people who are opposed to racism, who are opposed to all the isms, right, are nonetheless willing to embrace anti-Semitism. And my theory on it, my view on a matter is because if you view the world through this oppressor-oppressed lens, everything is oppressor and oppressed. It's all power relationships, and then the intersectional connections between those power relationships, which is where intersectional theory comes from, that phrase. Then Jews are a real problem for your theory, because there is no greater example of an historically oppressed people for the past 2,000 years than Jews. They have been kicked out of every country. They have been legally, abused. They have been physically abused from pogroms in Eastern Europe and everything. And yet they have been incredibly and dramatically successful as a group. And the statistics show, I mean, they're 0.05% of the world population, and you look at the number of Jews who are Nobel Prize winners in physics and other sciences, and and our lawyers and our successful people, in Hollywood and all these places. And so it's like, it shows the blatant contradiction of this oppressor-oppressed theory, that it doesn't comport with the facts, that it's not right. It's not a right theory, and it's not drawn from the facts. And so you have to hate the very people who factually contradict your theory. And Jews kind of do that. They're not trying to do it. They're just trying to live their lives, and they're very successful at it because but you can't be successful if there is systemic racism. That explains why blacks can't succeed if there's systemic racism, or systemic sexism, which is why women can't succeed, and so on and so on. So if there's been systemic anti-Semitism, which is undoubted and clear for 2,000 years, how is it possible they've been so successful? Yeah. So I think that's partially why it's kind of feed into this, and it becomes a feature of opposition to the Western ideals of the free market and limited government, protection of rights, and things of that sort.
Yeah, and just to bring up my own sort of personal experience. So I'm not sure if you guys know, our viewers know, I'm visiting Israel right now. I've been here for a few days, and I've talked to a few sort of even non-objectivist Israelis, and it's interesting to hear sort of like a different view of the holidays themselves, or sort of like celebrations. Basically, I was talking to him about sort of like Christian holidays, like many of them are, especially in I come from like a Greek Catholic family, so many of them are sort of like somber. Many of them are like really, you sort of like go down, you sort of like are happy, or not even happy, but it's very like somber. And he used sort of like celebration to describe Easter for me. And in my mind, you never associate Christian holidays or Christian sort of like important things with like celebrations. But he said the reason he did it is because almost all Jewish holidays are sort of celebrations. Basically, every single holiday is basically, yeah, these guys tried to kill us all, and we managed to defend ourselves against them. We managed to sort of persevere that. And yeah, it is something that is sort of unique, and sort of to bring it back to Ayn Rand and sort of her perception of altruism. There is, I think, really great line, or sort of like a contradiction within altruism, right? It's altruism is supposed to be about giving up, and you see the connections to Christianity. But the big problem is like, how can everybody give up? Who are you giving it up to? Why is it moral for me to give up something, but not immoral for somebody to take it? And the only way to sort of that work is if somebody else doesn't deserve it, right? And so you have the sort of people, Adam, like you said, who are successful, who manage to, despite all the problems, manage to sort of persevere, and not only persevere, be on top, be the number one in every sort of metric you can ask. And that is again going, I mean, that's going in the face of altruism, right? It's the people who did sort of like lose everything and still have, and are refusing to sort of bow down to anything. And yeah, it is truly, I mean, just to make one more connection, and then I'll go to you guys again. Something that you guys might remember for a few years ago, when Kanye West went on sort of like really anti-Semitic spiel. And the fact is, he was basically completely canceled for it, right? He was even by the left, by the right, by everybody all over the place. And now it's sort of like, now that he still continues to do most of the same stuff, now it's no longer the problem, because now Israel is sort of the problem. And again, there is this connection like to from Zionism to basically a Jew, right? So yeah, because Israel is doing something that gives us sort of I don't know if we're right, but sort of gives us an opportunity to basically go after all Jews. And the only sometimes you oftentimes see from the left sort of pointing towards the in quotes good Jews, right? You know, Finkelstein, he actually talks against Israel or this organization, the Jewish Voice for Peace. They are actually against the state of Israel, and that's what makes them moral. It's denying their own. I think
you should know that the students that Jews for Peace, that's a bogus organization. It's actually run. It's actually been exposed to have been actually being run by some Arabs. It's, I mean, yeah, it's so blatantly anti-Semitic. They clearly don't know anything about Judaism. I mean, like they're you know, they did a for Hanukkah they did they put up a picture on their X account of a candelabra. Which was supposed to be a menorah, but it wasn't a menorah. I mean, because the Hanukkah menorah has 8 candles, but because the standard one, non-Hanukkah one, is 7 candles. And I mean, it's just like they clearly, I mean, yeah. And people have pointed out that their signs when they're in Hebrew, the Hebrew goes left to right instead of right to left. And I mean, it's just yeah. Don't refer to them as like, oh, this is a Jewish organization or some Israelis who've lost their minds. It's not. It's a front organization that was created by some Arabs to try to show like, oh, see, there are Jews who even criticize Jews, because that's what they need. This is like Haaretz, and which is an Israeli newspaper, right? It's basically a pro-Hamas, pro-Iran mouthpiece. And it's like, and every vile anti-Semite that comments to me or appears in my feed on X that I have, that of the ones that I haven't blocked, they love to quote from Haaretz. They love it, right? Why? Because it gives them cover, right? Like, oh, you can't accuse me of being anti-Semitic because look, some Jews are saying it. Of course, that itself is a collectivist way of thinking, right? That itself exposes their collectivism and exposes their anti-Semitism. So, and by the way, the Nazis were the same. Why did the Nazis set up what were called the Judenrat, which were the Jewish councils? They were actually explicitly created official councils called the Judenrat, the Jewish councils, to run the ghettos. Why did they do that? Why didn't they just run them themselves? Because they needed the cover, right? This is true. All evil can't be explicit, because if it's explicit, people will recognize it for what it is. They all, even Hitler and had all of his rationalizations for why he needed to be anti-Semitic, right? He didn't just come out and say, I hate the Jews because they're Jews, right? No, it's because the Jews are trying to take over the government, and they're bringing disease, and they're immoral, and they're fostering, and they're money grubbing. Like, he had all of his arguments, and he had out of context things he could point to, the Rothschilds running the banks and things like that, right? I mean, they're not, yeah. So this is typical of them, but they're typical of them being the anti-racist, and I mean the racist and anti-Semites. But yeah, I mean, your point about, the Jews kind of just embracing, life and celebrating and things of this sort is exactly right. The phrase, the phrase you made is a common joke about Jewish holidays, actually. And Jewish holidays, not like Israeli holidays like Independence Day, which was yesterday, but like actual Jewish holidays like Passover and Hanukkah and all these holidays. There's a joke that you can summarize every single Jewish holiday as follows: they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. It's just
and somebody made that comment in the chat.
Yeah.
Jonathan?
Yeah.
I want to just, if I could, acknowledge some of our super chatters, Daniel, with your permission. Jeff Bannister, really, thank you so much for that contribution. Bonnie Bertrand, thank you for that contribution. PC, thank you for your contribution. PC says Palestine does not exist. And we've got a bunch of YouTube monthly members like El Rito and and so many others who are keeping the chats very active. And, you know, we need you. We bring you not only just content 7 days a week inspired by Ayn Rand's objectivism, but we bring you professors and experts like Adam Mossoff. You know, people pay tens of thousands of dollars to sit in this gentleman's class, and you have the opportunity to interface with him and learn from him, and on topics all over the board. So please take this opportunity to support us. I know Daniel will put a link in the chat to become a monthly member, because we're here 7 days a week with, you know, discussion on current events inspired by Ayn Rand's objectivism. And you know what? We are all students of objectivism. We are all like you. We are learning it. We are discussing it. We're being challenged by it. That's why we offer some of the study groups. Read along Fountainhead, read along We the Living, and you know, supporting us is a great investment, not just in the future, but it's in your own education and your own well-being as well. So thank you.
Very well put, John.
And we have one more super chat from PC. Thank you so much. He says Adolf was leftist. That's a fact. And yeah, sometimes you hear that claim, and it's sort of, I can see when some people want to make, because they want to say, you know, our good side is all the way here and all the bad stuff is all the way there. And sort of, you know, if you go by the actual opposites, individualism versus collectivism, and you want to place individualism on the right, then yeah, communism, Nazism, all types of collectivism are on the left. But it's not like you have Republicans on the left and Democrats on the left and Republicans on the right in individualism versus collectivism. If you do the same thing, they're both much more status than I think Americans deserve in the current scape. So you should always, when it comes to these sort of like titles to give to somebody, you should look for clarity. And yeah, in some ways, it's good to define sort of different types of collectivism, but only you know, in the fundamentals, I think it doesn't matter if Adolf Hitler was on the left or on the right. He was collectivistic. It's not like that will make it much worse for what he did. But yeah, to bring it a bit back to discuss Mohsen Mahdavi a bit more. So yeah, he was released basically on bail, my understanding is. And I guess we can discuss. Judge basically ruled that he didn't pose a threat, or he didn't pose a threat to public safety. Yeah.
Or that through he did, there wasn't a convert. Typically, when people are detained, you know, so when you're first arrested and you go to jail, that's not prison. Jail is the intermediate step when you're first arrested. By the way, I'm not an expert or specialist in criminal law. These are just the things that I just know, had picked up from both my general legal education many decades ago and then other things. But so yeah, so he was being detained. So one of the questions is, well, when they're trying to decide whether to release you or not before your final hearing, you know, to determine what should happen to you in the criminal context, right? One of the big issues is, are you a flight risk, right? So are you going to, abscond from the jurisdiction? And you know, and one of the things the judge said was like, well, he's clearly not a flight risk because he has a home, he owns a house, apparently in Vermont, you know, which is like really weird, because I'll tell you something. He's a graduate student at Columbia University. I was a graduate student at Columbia University for 6 years in the 1990s in a PhD program in philosophy. And I'll tell you, the number of people who owned homes as graduate students in Columbia in 1990s was zero. And homes were a lot cheaper back then than they are now. So it's like, how does this guy have a house? And apparently it's like it's like a summer home in addition to where he lives in New York. You know, is this guy being funded? I mean, these are serious questions that need to be asked and looked into, right? I mean, people are just kind of accepting like, oh, okay, he has a home, he has a house here, he's not going to leave. It's like, well, maybe. I mean, we already know that there's extensive funding of activities. Iran explicitly admits it. Hamas has said it, that they do it. We already know that all of these groups, the Students for Justice in Palestine, are coordinating, right? They coordinate all of these protests, these street protests and campus protests across the country. They have money for these protests. If you've looked, all of those nice tents that were set up at the encampments and stuff, like, where did those tents come from? And they're all the same tents. So it's like, who had the money to go and spend $10,000 at RAI and buy all these tents for these people, right? It's not the graduate students. So it's like, there's already like, there's a lot of questions here that, and it's unfortunate that the judge in this case was not asking those questions.
Yeah, and so we have some information from the court filings. I think the biggest one that everybody has sort of saw as like that is a bit crazy is the fact there was an incident from I think like 10 years ago where it is alleged that Mohsen Mahdavi went into like a gun store and basically bragged about I think I'm not sure if I have exact word, but something along the lines, I used to kill Jews in Palestine, or I like to kill Jews. And there wasn't, my understanding is there was no full investigation by the FBI. Basically, what it was is they went to check on him, basically asked him a bunch of questions. He denied that he said anything, and the FBI said it's pretty much good enough to sort of not continue. And yeah, so that's one thing that we can talk a bit about. But I think even if you ignore that, saying it's one incident 10 years ago, whatever, the fact is that this guy has been the vice president of the organization at Columbia that have organized protests, that disturbed peace, that occupied buildings, that threatened Jewish students. How is this guy not a potential threat? I mean, what if another sort of protest gets called up and something more happens? I mean, to go to you, Adam, of course, I don't know as much about the legal stuff as you do, about how especially something like evidence like this usually is sort of considered. But yeah, what do you make of some of the things that were alleged?
All right. So so by the way, the points about the Hawaii doing this, it was two independent gun store owners who reported this, right? So this wasn't like oh, it was just one guy who may have misheard him, right? So he apparently visited at two different times, went to two different gun stores and made these remarks. And both of the gun store owners, this shows you like how serious people take the law. They both reported him to the FBI, right? So, and to be frank, I don't know why the FBI didn't follow up on this in any meaningful way. There's always, just because the FBI chose not to pursue it doesn't tell us anything. I mean, every kind of crisis and every, from 9/11 to October 7th involved all of these clues that the officials were not following up on and taking advantage of and saying, like, gee, there's all these people all these Arabs who are taking flight school lessons in the United States. This was a big, like, why wasn't the FBI investigating this? Like, why were they doing this? And things of this sort. So, why the FBI chose not to do it, I don't know. They shouldn't have done it, right? I mean, clearly they shouldn't have done it. Who goes to a gun store and says, not only I killed Jews in Palestine, but then says, I like to kill Jews. And by the way, he didn't use the word Zionist. He said Jews. That's the quote. So, because it was 2015 and they didn't know yet that you have to only say Zionist. The word hadn't gotten out yet that the code word is Zionist. So, I mean, and again, the rules for green card holders in the United States are it's not you have to be fully convicted of a crime and the crime has to be a felony, not a misdemeanor, which I mean, there's different types of crime, and it has to be, a jury trial. You have to go through all of your appeals all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, before you can be deported. That's not the law, nor should that be the law. Now I'm not an expert on immigration law, so I don't know exactly what the precise details are and what the precise legal requirements are or even necessarily should be. But there's a conflation that often people make between due process and due process that's accorded to someone who is committed of felonies. And it's and that's not the case. That's a wrong conflation. It's an equivocation. Due process has different meanings in different contexts. There's due process for civil trials when you sue someone for trespass. There's due process for misdemeanors when you sue someone, or when you, for instance, you get a traffic ticket. You don't get to go to court and get proof beyond a reasonable doubt and get a jury trial and all sort of stuff, right? And by the way, if you refuse to pay your parking tickets and your parking ticket rises to the level of a misdemeanor now, you still don't get a jury trial and all those things and proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's because that's all for felonies, which is a particular type of crime. And so the fact is that they are getting due process because they're getting represented by lawyers. Khalil, I think, had 7 lawyers, which again, people are like, how is it possible for him to get represented by 7 lawyers? And some of these lawyers are some really high power law firms, right? So people who charge, $800,000 an hour. It's like, how is he being able to afford this? Again, questions about funding. But then on top of that, they're appearing before, an immigration judge. The judge is making a determination. And from my understanding, that's the process for green card revocation. And one of the key factors or issues in the green card revocation isn't that you've committed a crime and that you've been adjudged and fully convicted of a crime by a jury and it's been gone through your appeals all the way to the state Supreme Court and things of the sort. It's every green card owner in this country is asked, do you support the violent overthrow of the United States government or any peaceful Western government or ally of the United States, or do you belong to an organization that does this? And these organizations, the Students for Justice in Palestine, are calling for the violent overthrow of Israel, and have done much more than that, have called for violent uprising explicitly and have engaged in violent activities. And so at a minimum, they committed perjury and fraud on their green card forms. And this isn't like I said, a criminal trial. All you have to do is show that, and that's sufficient enough to show that they violated the terms in which they've entered the country.
Can I play Adam, a quick devil's advocate?
Oh, I love it. Yes, please.
Briefly, well, let's say they're deported. Those ideas have an audience here in the U.S. So simply deporting these players or these individuals, that's what's so frustrating to me is not that these unsavory assholes have these abhorrent ideas, but that there seems to be an audience for it here at home. So if we deport this crew, what's to stop just new rabble rousers, new leaders of the anti-Israel, anti-Western pact to clamp up those ideas? The ideas are not disparaged. Those people might be deported, but the ideas are not disparaged. And I'll just briefly say, it reminds me when I was at Northwestern, there was a professor who was explicitly anti-Semitic. His name was, I think, Arthur Butts, but he was ostracized. No one wanted anything to do with him. And although he was tenured, he was seen as a joke. And that's what's frustrating to me, is that we could deport these people, but these ideas are not ostracized as they need to be.
Right. All right. So that's a secondary issue though, right? So the bad ideas that lead people to commit murder and things of that sort aren't being addressed when you send someone to prison. You can still say the bad ideas are out there. The belief that you can just be a nihilist or take what you want and kill and destroy other people because the world is your plaything and you can just do whatever you want to it for whatever reasons. The bad ideas of subjectivism and moral relativism and nihilism, right? That's not addressed by sending someone away to prison and convicting them if they're a citizen, right? But the point is that they're not being deported because they have the ideas. They're deported because they're taking action on the basis of these ideas in some way, shape, or form. And I think it's you can be a 100% in principle advocate for open immigration, that people should be allowed to come to this country and as much as they want, but still believe, and rightly so, that a country has the legitimate rights to ensure that people who are coming to this country to engage in in agitate, in quote, agitation, unquote, or to foment, violence and crimes, that they can be and should be excluded from entering the country. To make this kind of very clear, right? Someone's at the border and they're asked, "Are you coming here to commit crimes?" "Oh yeah, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start making Molotov cocktails and I'm going to start throwing them into storefront windows. I am a communist revolutionary, and I'm going to be acting on that and inciting other people to do so." It is not a violation of the right of rights to say to that person, "We are excluding you from coming into our country. You are not allowed to come in." And this is why they asked that question on the green cards, for that reason. It's not to exclude the ideas, it's to exclude what we've been seeing happen on campuses, which is the outright criminal acts and violent behavior.
Isn't that also, briefly, I know we're almost out of time, but isn't that part of what was the differentiation in Ms. Rand's testimony among in front of the House Committee on American Activities? The difference between having ideas and participating in groups that are working explicitly to overthrow the government. I'm making a mess of it, but there's a couple of great books that have been written on that issue people should check out.
Yeah. I don't remember it exactly, but there's a very good book that was recently published on it as well that kind of discusses it by one of those scholars associated with the Ayn Rand Institute, I believe. But yeah, I mean, so for instance, as I've told the story before, I think on a prior, ARUCK podcast, my introduction to this issue was before I even went to law school, back when I was in graduate school in philosophy at Columbia University, of all places. So we used to have a wine and cheese hour for the professors and the graduate students every week, and the then chair of the philosophy department, Akil Bagrami, once was chatting with a bunch of graduate students, a bunch of us, and he was and I forget what the context or what prompted this, but he complained vociferously about how he had to lie on his green card application in response to this question, because he had been a member of the Communist Party of India. And communist parties have in their founding documents that they're dedicated to the overthrow of the United States government. And so it's so, by the way, that the whole context for this, like, it speaks volumes that he felt like he could say this openly at the philosophy department at Columbia, which, by the way, shows you, like, these protests that are happening at Columbia. I mean, big shocker, right? That question, like, are you a member of or support organizations like the communist parties that are dedicated in their founding documents, right, to the overthrow or destruction of the U.S. government or one of its allies? Awesome dog, by the way, Jonathan. I have two beagles. I love dogs. Is a legitimate question for the U.S. government to ask, and it's a legitimate grounds for especially if the person has committed perjury and fraud by lying on that form, deporting them, saying, "Sorry, you came into the U.S. not for purposes of education, but for other purposes for which we do not support." Yeah.
And briefly, the book is Robert Mayhew's Ayn Rand and Song of Russia, Communism and Anti-Communism in 1940s Hollywood, and it's a great read.
Yes.
And with that, we are out of time. So let me just go to Adam, to you again, if you have any last thoughts, and also where can people find you or follow you?
They can find me on X, under my name, Adam Mossoff, where I post regularly on issues of anti-Semitism and the war against the West. It's represented in the Middle East by Israel's defending the West, and more generally on the internet, if you're interested in my scholarship on intellectual property and things of that sort. If you just Google me, you'll find tons of resources.
Jonathan, any last thoughts? And where can people
find you? I recommend it to follow Adam on X and check out Can You Really Love a Dog, which Dr. Leonard Peikoff, Ayn Rand's intellectual heir, wrote, that I was privileged to publish. It's available on Amazon. And thank you all for your support of the ARCUK.
Thank you for having me, Daniel and Jonathan. It's always a pleasure to be on this program, your programs.
And we also have a super chat from Christopher. Thank you so much. And with that, thank you everybody for watching. We'll be back tomorrow, and bye-bye.